Professor Marcus Mescher, thank you for joining us. You are an associate professor of Christian ethics at Xavier University. Is that correct?
That's right.
And an alumnus of right here at Boston College. So glad to have you back for that. Recently, you released some research on moral injury and trying to investigate what kind of moral injury has come out of the sexual abuse crisis,
Mhm.
and developing a survey to try and get some information on that and so forth. So one thing that kind of stands out in the beginning is, what exactly do you mean by moral injury? Like, what would that look like? How would you know in an individual if they'd experienced moral injury?
Yeah, thanks, James. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today and to talk a little bit about what I've learned from the last couple of years. I first learned about moral injury at Boston College, but it was in the context of survivors of war or veterans of war returning from combat and trying to come to grips with um, the shame that they felt for what they did or saw while in combat. And so in the literature on moral injury, it really comes out of walking with veterans who are trying to make sense of their identity and their moral compass or their relationship with God uh, in the wake of just the horrors of war, especially in a military setting where there's an honor code, there's a chain of command. These soldiers are investing themselves in trusting that when they're given a command, they not only have to follow it, but they should follow it because of the honor code and the chain of command. But then, as you can imagine, when soldiers get through combat and they learn that some of those directives were imprudent or for example, if there was a drone strike and the drone operator was told, you're going to take out a terrorist cell, but in fact, they later find out it was a family wedding or it was, kids coming home from school, then there's this kind of wrestling with a deep sense of betrayal. And although moral injury comes from this context and is largely related to acts of perpetrators of crime and maybe that sense of betrayal that, I was told to do something by someone I trusted, and it turns out that now I've violated my moral compass, that this term is really helpful. This term moral injury is really helpful for trying to understand the spiritual and psychological and moral dimensions of betrayal. And it's being used more popularly in a number of professions. So we're seeing it now in law enforcement, when maybe a police officer takes the life of an unarmed civilian, or that their colleague does, and they're trying to make sense of their identity or their belonging to an institution in the face of that kind of betrayal. We're also seeing it in the healthcare settings, especially during the pandemic, when you had so many people making great sacrifices and then trying to come to grips with the ignorance or indifference of other people, or the decisions that they were making during the pandemic that seemed pretty selfish or seemed not to really take seriously the impact of their choices on other people, including on healthcare providers. And we're even seeing it in education settings too, where teachers are feeling a sense of moral injury, maybe a betrayal that their administrators or their students or the parents of students don't necessarily have their best interests at heart. And a couple of years ago, I got involved in a conference at Villanova where Father Richard Lenon spoke. And he was one of my favorite professors at the STM, and his class on the church is a class that I think about all the time. And I wrote my dissertation at Boston College on solidarity. And as news was breaking about the Pennsylvania grand jury report in 2018, and as I got to know more and more people who were impacted by clergy sexual abuse, I started to wonder, what does solidarity with survivors of clergy sexual abuse look like? And I think by disposition, I wanted to get to the hope and healing right away. So I jumped in with 2 feet on the restorative justice work to try to, bring the truth into the light and figure out, like, as allies or advocates with survivors of clergy sexual abuse, how can we be agents of restorative justice? And that's where my work began. But the more that I listened to and learned from survivors of clergy sexual abuse and their loved ones, the more that I really came to see that I don't understand the scope of the wound caused by this profound betrayal,
Yeah.
because of who the priest represents. That the priest acts in persona Christi. A lot of Catholics see the priest as close to God or next to God or actually, God. And so when you have people who are raised to believe that priests can never sin, or what they do is never wrong, or that these are people who operate with not just power, but with sacred trust, when people are harmed by clergy, I think there's an added weight to that harm. And so I realized that if we don't understand the scope of the wounds caused by this profound betrayal, this betrayal of sacred trust, then we can't jump to the healing work. And so my hunch when I proposed this grant to do a 2-year research project to see if we could come up with an instrument to measure moral injury caused by clergy sexual abuse was to use moral injury as a hermeneutical lens to see if it's a valid measure of this kind of the persistent psychological distress, spiritual anguish, moral confusion, social isolation, and distrust for institutions that seem to characterize moral injury. And after 2 years of work, we that's exactly what we did. We believe we have the data that we need to show that our instrument does effectively measure moral injury, and to say that we're not only dealing with moral injury in survivors of clergy sexual abuse, but also their loved ones or other people who are proximate to more morally injurious events, to people who work for and represent the church. And I would say even just it's a fact of the matter that we're dealing with a morally injured church. In his first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul says that we're all one body, that we're many members, but one body. And if one part suffers, all parts suffer with it. And so, my interest as a moral theologian is in really trying to come to grips with the moral harm, certainly that is most acute in the survivor community, but also across so many people who remain in the church and the millions who've left the Catholic Church, especially as it relates to moral conscience, because conscience means to know together. And so if we don't have the full truth, if people are being kind of kept in the dark about the scope of abuse, or perpetrators that may be getting moved around by church officials, if we're not operating with sufficient sensitivity to the experience of survivors, if there is too much ignorance and indifference in the face of this profound betrayal, then I think there's a lot of really interesting theological and moral and pastoral implications to better understanding moral injury and its presence in our church.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And hearing what you're saying, and as I've been thinking about this as well, that seems, over the years, often the kind of things that I've heard from within the church hierarchy is an interesting sort of narrow scope of appreciation of what the damage is that has been caused by the crisis. There's conversation about violation of vows. There's this perception of the priest as engaging in inappropriate indulgence. There's concern about spoiling the reputation of the church and undermining clerical authority. But somehow it seems that there are, at least within certain areas within the hierarchy, these blind spots about the fact that no, there was a person here that was hurt, a victim, and that there are also consequences for the whole church community when this kind of abuse occurs. And I think that's part of what's really valuable to me about the research that you're engaged in. Does my read sound in the in the right ballpark to you?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, James. At least that was the way. I mean, I've been a lifelong Catholic. I was an altar server, went to, Catholic schools my entire life, all the way, since kindergarten. And it was always presented to me as a few bad apples were responsible for clergy sexual abuse, that these were outliers, and that this was all far distant in the past. And so spending the last 2 years researching this, I came to see that first of all, it wasn't just a few bad apples. We're talking about thousands of perpetrators just in the United States alone, and hundreds of thousands of survivors of clergy sexual abuse. That even if we're dealing with a very small number of the overall number of priests, which we're thinking maybe it's about 4% of clergy who have perpetrated sexual abuse, that in many cases these were serial predators, and that they abused just dozens of individuals. And because of clericalism and hierarchicalism, it was very hard for survivors to come forward, to lift their voice, to be believed. I mean, that was, I think, one of the hardest things that I learned from walking with survivors over the last several years, was just the ways in which survivors typically kept this event to themselves. They were protecting their parents and siblings and friends and family from what happened to them for a number of reasons. One, because they didn't think anyone would believe them, or they didn't want to just have this information totally destroy other people in the same way that it destroyed them. Survivors of clergy sexual abuse very often talk about this abuse like the shattering of their soul, or the rape or murder of their soul, or just being left to die. Some survivors have told me, like, I am nothing, or I am dead on the inside, or I am like a dirty rag that no amount of bleach could ever clean. And so there's a real sense of futility that survivors feel, like, why bother? Why would someone take my word against this priest that everyone holds up on a pedestal? And two, I think it's also important to point out that this isn't just something that's reserved to the past. Although I do think the Dallas Charter has really made some important reforms in the church, we're seeing more and more adult survivors of clergy sexual abuse come forward. And very often they feel like people don't really care about their experience as a survivor of clergy sexual abuse. People presume that these were two consenting adults, or the way the church talks about it, that this was like an indiscretion, or the priest broke his vow of celibacy, rather than to see it for what it is, that very often the survivors were totally blindsided by this abuse. They were going to this priest because they felt trust, maybe even protected by the vow of celibacy, and they went to this priest in a position of incredible vulnerability, and then had that vulnerability violated. And then to have so many people who just just presume, like, well, you were trying to seduce the priest, or you had ulterior motives, and to not recognize that. This is something I learned in the very first weekend at Boston College, that if you are a minister, whether you're ordained or lay, there is an asymmetry of power. When you are the person who's been trained or educated or have any kind of ecclesial authority, that there's an asymmetry of power there, and that you have to do everything you can to protect other people and ensure really ethical boundaries in ministry to keep people from being hurt in this way. And so I think that the church has a lot more work to do, not only to curb and try to prevent clergy sexual abuse, but even for other people in the church. I mean, I think of David Haas, in liturgical music, for example, right, who dozens of women have come forward to talk about the way that they have been abused by him. And so I think we have to be on guard for the ways in which people trade on charisma or this sacred trust, and then use that to gain leverage on people, and use power over those people. And we're still really far from the transparency and accountability that we need to make the church a safe place for everyone.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, and you kind of mentioned this, but it seems one other thing that I've observed that's interesting is there has been some substantive movements, programs that have come up in the church to help prevent future abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, is there a role in the research that you've done in terms of doing the next step of, like, bringing healing and correction for abuses that have already occurred?
That's a great question, James. I think that one of the most surprising findings for us and the work that we did was, we created this instrument to measure moral injury, and we created a survey. And in the work that we were doing, we interviewed survivors of clergy sexual abuse who had identified themselves to us. We interviewed current and previous employees of the church, people who worked in a parish or the diocese. And then as our control group, we surveyed over 200 undergraduates at a Jesuit university. And we were expecting to have the lowest levels of moral injury in those undergraduates, thinking that they would be the farthest removed from clergy sexual abuse. And in fact, among our control group, 6 undergraduate students identified themselves as survivors of clergy sexual abuse, which, I'm ashamed to admit, I didn't think of survivors of clergy sexual abuse being in my classroom. But I think it underscores the point that survivors are everywhere we look. And that clergy sexual abuse is, an especially profound betrayal of sacred trust in an ecclesial setting. But the fact of the matter is that more than 70% of sexual violence happens in families. And so I think in terms of next steps, we have to see this as a profoundly social problem and ecclesial problem. And I have to say, as a lifelong Catholic, I have never heard a single homily about sexual violence, whether it's in a home, among family members. Very often it's, someone that the survivor knows and thinks that they can trust, or whether it's on a college campus. And we know that, sexual violence on college campuses and even in a lot of high schools is a rampant problem. And then obviously we have survivors of clergy sexual abuse in so many parishes and parts of so many families. And so I think a really important next step for the church is to actually create and sustain ministry to survivors of sexual abuse, and to make that a priority, and to give training to pastoral ministers, to educators, to all parish staff, to say this is how we can better support survivors of sexual violence, whether it's clergy sexual abuse or in intimate partner settings or in families or in random acts of violence as well. Right. But in addition, then, too, we've got to do the work of prevention. There's that saying that prevention is the best medicine. And so I think, we have programs like Virtus and, the safe church trainings, and that's good. And I think that's important. But we've got to find ways that we can walk and chew gum so that we're doing the direct ministry to survivors and to their loved ones. I think a lot of loved ones, there's high rates of moral injury among loved ones who, feel like I let my son or daughter or my sibling down, and to give them spaces to process that. And then for survivors to come together and to share their stories and to find a source of compassion and solidarity among themselves. But then also for all of us who are not survivors of clergy sexual abuse, to find ways that we can be better advocates and allies, and to ensure that churches are safe places for everyone, neighborhoods, schools, homes are safe places for everyone, and to see this as a problem that's on all of our shoulders, rather than the work of SNAP or a particular survivor group, or people who've been personally touched by the issue. I think we've got to leverage the parish and all church spaces as places where we've got to really kind of be way more preventative and not just reactionary to the problem, but to figure out ways that we can, start with sex ed. When I teach a class on marriage and family almost every spring, and I will ask my students, that are 25 or 30 students, how many of you got the birds and the bees talk from your parents when you were growing up? And out of a class of 25 or 30, maybe 2 or 3 hands will go up. I think that there's so much stigma and shame and secrecy and silence around human sexuality that it's compounding the isolation and the stigma and shame around sexual violence, because we just don't know how to have healthy conversations about this. So I think in the church we have to do a much better job of integrating a healthy, loving, mutually respectful uh, vision of human sexuality that is integrated into a robust theological anthropology rooted in inherent human dignity, equality across genders, and inclusive of sexual orientation, so that no particular person is walking around feeling like that they are dirty or less than, or that if someone takes advantage of them, that this is some kind of punishment or some part of divine plan, but that on the contrary, this is something we all have to lament together, protest together, and do everything in our power to prevent anyone from ever experiencing that kind of stigma or shame or isolation that leaves so many people feeling invisible, insignificant, and even powerless.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Again, kind of what I was thinking about. A lot of the prevention measures that have been taken have tended to focus again on, I don't want to say clericalist exactly, but it's been this focus on how to prevent or set up formations so that ministers are not becoming perpetrators, but to see it more in this like holistic, how can we as a greater society
Mm.
be forming young people up in ways so that they're all they have their own tools for protecting themselves and for uh, having a healthy development that way. I think that's a great perspective. um, in the report you suggest that one of the things that's helpful for people who have directly been um, victims of abuse
Mm.
is having communities of other people who have had similar experience, that they can be open and safe in having conversations about that. I'm wondering if there are other things that you're maybe specific concrete things that people might do in pastoral ministry to help serve those needs. But also I wonder about like the student body of the university, as you're describing folks who may not have had direct contact with it, but have still sustained some kind of moral injury through second or third order effects like that, and how we might respond to that in a pastoral way on campuses or in parishes.
Yeah, another good question, James. Thanks. Uh, I would say that moral injury is really complex, and we need to parse out differences between moral injury that perpetrators carry, moral injury that survivors carry, moral injury that bystanders or people who've been exposed to a morally injurious event carry, and people too that maybe feel implicated because they're Catholic, and they feel ashamed at what not only was done in their church by leaders in their church, but also covered up, instead of bringing the truth to light. In so many instances, the church seemed to care more about its reputation, or trying to, quote unquote, protect the faithful from scandal, rather than holding perpetrators of abuse accountable and protecting vulnerable people from those perpetrators. And so, given the complexity of moral injury, I think there's really going to need to be like a really complex menu of options to provide the resources to overcome the persistent psychological distress, spiritual anguish, moral confusion, social isolation, and distrust for institutions that very often we see as symptoms of moral injury. And so I think maybe we can just start with kind of like going through those symptoms, like if people really are, exposed to a toxic system or culture. I'm publishing an article that's coming out this summer that's proposing a taxonomy of moral injury, just because it is such a complex term, and it's very different for perpetrators as compared to victims, survivors, or to bystanders. And one of the things that I've learned is that you can carry moral injury just by being exposed to betrayal. There's something called betrayal trauma, that when you witness betrayal, it leaves this kind of imprint of harm on you, where it's really hard for you to trust other people or to feel safe. And if people are on edge, if they're in a state of hypervigilance, then that can cause a lot of anxiety and distress. And so in some ways, it's almost like firsthand smoke, like when you're smoking, secondhand smoke when you're in the presence of a smoker, and then thirdhand smoke, where you might not even know that someone was smoking, but because someone smoked in the room you're in, the tobacco smoke is still in the fabric of the furniture or in the carpet, and you can still get some of that, the ill effects of being in the room, even though you never saw it. And so I think, starting at the lowest level, the least acute levels of moral injury, I think the church has a lot of work to do to regain people's trust, right? Like tens of millions of people have left the Catholic Church, and they don't think of it as a safe place or as a place that's welcoming, a place that's inviting and that really honors the dignity of every human person in a way that's rooted in mutual respect and co-responsibility. And so I think to begin with, doing the work of trying to help people feel a sense of safety and trust. And the way to do that is to help people feel known. And I think that's going to be an uphill battle given our current social context where, given the distrust and division and polarization and the way that people mistreat each other on social media, there's a lot of really good reasons for people to keep their guard up, to be suspicious of vulnerability and authenticity, because they're worried that if they share something in the spirit of vulnerability or authenticity, it could be used against them. They could be mocked or ridiculed. I mean, there's just so much contempt and derision and scorn in our social context, and especially on social media, that I think we've got, the first order of the day is to go back to how we treat each other, and to really work on the curiosity and the compassion and the courage that it takes to really let people feel known, to be cared for and about. Greg Boyle uses this line that we need to stand in awe at what other people carry rather than in judgment at how they carry it. I think he's onto something there, and I think that's a lot of work that we need to do, just to lower the temperature and not take everything so personally, or feel like every issue is a zero-sum game where there's winners and losers, or that every political issue has to be something that I identify with personally, and that the stakes are so high because if I lose, then I question my value or my ability to belong or to matter. So I think that there's a lot of social work that needs to be done just in terms of relationships, and I hope that universities and parishes and just any place that identifies as a community to build a sense of belonging, that they're doing the work to really ask, who are the people who feel safe here, who feel comfortable here, who can show up freely and fully them, and who are the people who don't identify with us, or who might feel written off by us, or just feel like they aren't represented by us. Pope Francis has been working really tirelessly over the last couple of years to call us to build, this culture of encounter, and to build communities of an ever wider we, so that we don't think in categories of us and them, that there is no them. And so I think that's kind of the place to begin. And then going up from there, once we can kind of prime the pump a little bit, or at least set the table for some robust relationships where people can feel a sense of safety and trust, mutual respect, and co-responsibility, where they feel like they are understood, and then they better understand others, then I think we can create the conditions where it would be safe and maybe not triggering or traumatizing for us to better understand the particular trauma. The word trauma comes from the Greek word for wound, the wounds that people carry, and then to build those circles of compassion, the circles of solidarity, the circles of advocacy, so that people can let others into what they are carrying without fear of being judged, or disappointing other people, or being disapproved by other people, and to do the healing work together. And I'm glad you pointed that in our report. We really did find that the survivors who have done the most recovery, the survivors who are farthest along on the journey of healing, it is because they have discovered relationships where they are profoundly cared for, where they can be freely and fully who they are, that they have people that they can count on to turn to when there are tough days. Like progress is not linear, it's not a straight line, it's a jumbled mess, and there's just as much regression as progress some days. And so to have that community where there's support but also accountability, that's really what is most valuable for survivors. And then I think for those of us who aren't survivors, I think we still have a lot to learn about the extent of the wounds. And so I think, to take that posture of humility and curiosity and to figure out like what more can we learn, and to realize that clergy sexual abuse is not a problem out there over there. It is very likely impacted our community, that there are probably people that we know who are survivors either of clergy sexual abuse or another form of sexual abuse. And if other people aren't telling us about what they're carrying, then we have to ask ourselves, what is it about me that I don't appear like a safe person to this survivor? One survivor told me that she doesn't identify with the term victim. She doesn't identify really with the term survivor. She actually she identifies with the term casualty, because she just feels like she's been left for dead by the church, that no one really cares about her. And Brian Massingale at Fordham, he talks about, this term coper, that there are people who are just trying to survive. And so I think the more that we can learn about what it's actually like to be a survivor of sexual abuse, to know that in too many cases, perpetrators were unleashed upon marginalized groups, marginalized by race, by gender, sometimes by sexual orientation, by economic class or legal status, that there are just layers of this trauma. And for all those layers of trauma, that means that there are just so many levels more work for us to do in terms of actually delivering on the restorative justice that all those who are impacted by clergy sexual abuse and sexual abuse in general really deserve. So yeah, there's a lot more work to be done, and it's going to take all of us to do the work. And when I was in college, I had the good fortune of spending time with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu would often say, there's no room for neutrality in the work for justice, right? If an elephant is standing on the tail of a mouse, you standing on the sidelines or you being neutral does nothing to help that mouse. And when we were in conversation, he was saying that the work of justice is like a symphony and everyone has an instrument to play. And I was, I think being a little bit of a devil's advocate. And I said, well, what about me? I mean, I don't have any rhythm, which is true. I have the rhythm of a corpse. I don't know how to play an instrument. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu was gentle, but very firm with me. And he looked me, straight in the eyes and he said, well, if the only instrument you can play is the triangle, then play the hell out of the triangle for justice. And I've taken that to heart ever since. Not all of us can be really vocal advocates or allies to try to bring healing to the survivor community or to anyone who's been impacted by this profound betrayal or moral injury in general. But there are things that we can all do in small ways to check in with other people. I mean, it really was hard to hear so many survivors who never told anyone about their abuse. And the Archdiocese of Chicago reports that on average, survivors of clergy sexual abuse wait 27 years before they come forward to tell about their abuse. And maybe they don't want to feel like a burden. Maybe they don't think anyone will believe them. But I also worry that's kind of an indictment on the quality of our relationships when people are carrying this level of trauma and they don't feel like anyone can be bothered to be led into this heavy load that they're carrying, or that people won't believe them, or that they'll be blamed for this abuse. So I think we've got a lot more work to do to show up, not just to survivors or those who carry moral injury, but to all the people that we're in touch with in a way that actually invests in each other and is curious about each other's lives and makes that attempt to make people feel known and cared about, and that, that our relationships are marked by safety and trust.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of work to do. One of the things that you pointed out there that stood out for me was, and this seems like a very interesting idea for me to think about in my own uh, spaces where I engage in ministry work, and that's identifying those who are going to feel less safe and welcome in the environment, and then having that be like having an awareness of that boundary be a way that shapes the rest of what I'm engaged in that
Mm.
activity. So you mentioned you have your the paper coming out in the summer about the lexicon. What else is coming up in your research in this area? What other work is down the
Yeah.
road?
Um, well, I appreciate your comment too, James, about being particularly sensitive to those on the margins. When I wrote my dissertation at Boston College on solidarity, I focused on the story of the Good Samaritan. And I had the great fortune of being able to spend time with Gustavo Gutierrez when he would come to BC for the Summer Institute. And I remember vividly, being able to spend a couple summers with him in 2008 and 2010 when he was at BCSTM, that he would say, the preferential option for the poor is exactly what the Samaritan does, going out of his way and into the ditch, taking up the vantage point of the person who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. And I do think there are a lot of survivors and probably a lot of people who've been mistreated by the church who could identify with the the robber's victim on the road to Jericho. My grandmother was Polish Catholic, and she fell in love with a Jewish man. And when she told her parish priest that she had fallen in love with a Jewish man, her priest said, "Well, you're going to hell." And she never wanted to step foot in a Catholic church ever again. Like, I mean, that hurt her so deeply. And I don't know that priest. I mean, maybe it was a flippant remark. Maybe he didn't mean anything by it. Maybe he was joking around. Um, but I think we've got to be really careful about the impact of our words. Sometimes we hide behind intentions and we say, "Oh, I didn't mean any offense," and sometimes we muzzle ourselves because we're so worried about cancer culture or call out culture. And I think instead of calling people out, we've got to call people in and to help us better understand the weight of our words. And then after the calling in, we've got to call people up, right? Like we can't settle for the status quo. This social context where there are so many people who really don't feel safe or who feel invisible or who feel insignificant, this shouldn't be tolerable to anyone. And that was something that Gustavo said all the time in class. The preferential option for the poor is not only about those who are economically poor, even though poverty is excruciating and dehumanizing, and it renders people subject to premature death. Gustavo would remind us that in Scripture, the poor are the outcasts. They're the socially insignificant. They're the non-persons. And when you look at mental health in this country, and especially young people in this country, and especially people of color or the LGBTQ members of our communities and our families, there are so many people, too many people, who question if they count, matter, or belong. And so, yeah, there's a lot of work that we have to do. And in the face of all this work that we have to do to build this ever wider we that Pope Francis is calling toward, I hope that my work on moral injury will be helpful for getting us to think about how maybe some of this is a response to betrayal, where people are on guard or they're more distrustful of entering into relationships because we see whether it's leaders we thought we could trust or institutions that maybe are more flawed than we'd like to admit, whether that's in the church or outside of the church, that people do have good reason to maybe be a little bit suspicious or suspect of having too much trust or investing too much, or yielding power, and being susceptible to having that power being used against them. So I am working on a book project that will look more closely at moral injury and moral conscience because, as I said earlier, moral conscience means to know together. I think it's important for us to confront the ways in which, keeping people in the dark or just perpetuating this social distrust and division, it's wounding conscience. the Jesuit philosopher John Kavanaugh, who wrote Following Christ in a Consumer Society, he has this throwaway line in that book, to rob people of the truth is to deaden conscience. And I think that there are a lot of people who are dealing with an impaired conscience because we don't have the full picture, and maybe we don't want the full picture. That we're part of what Pope Francis laments is this globalization of indifference, to say that's not my problem, that doesn't concern me. Kind of like the priest and the Levite in that story of the Good Samaritan, who see the robber's victim beaten, robbed, and left for dead, laying in the ditch, and they actually go to the other side of the road. They create more distance between themselves and the person who's been left for dead. And they're the anti-neighbor, as opposed to the Samaritan who goes nearby and draws near to take up that vantage point and make it his own. And so we've got to make sense of what is that globalization of indifference, or how do we respond to these mantras like you stay in your lane and I'll stay in mine, or I do me, you do you, this radical tolerance and non-judgmentalism, which is of course a farce, right? Like we are constantly impacting other people with the choices we make, and we are constantly being impacted by the choices other people make. So I think we've got a lot of wounds that we're all carrying, and the hyper individualistic culture that we're living in isn't giving us the tools that we need to actually figure out, like, how do we heal from betrayal, or how do we learn how to trust people again, or how do we build relationships marked by compassion and solidarity where there is adequate support, but also we can hold people lovingly accountable so that when they are responsible for harm, they don't hide behind, well, I didn't mean to, or we just cancel them out and cut them off and write them off, but to say, all right, that these are ways in which we can invite people into rituals. Rituals are the language of community, to say this is how we lament and repent and atone and do the work of reconciliation in a way that is inviting, that is always voluntary. I worry about the ways in which, especially in Christian settings, we kind of impose forgiveness on people. Almost every survivor that I've talked to, they were told they had to pray for their perpetrator and forgive their perpetrator. Many survivors talk about how they tried to reconcile with their perpetrator, and the perpetrator had no remorse, did not acknowledge the scope of harm that they were responsible for. Or they said something like, I went to confession, I did my penance, I don't owe you anything, and use the sacrament of reconciliation against people. So in all these distorted theologies, all these warped understandings of what it means to be human and to belong to community, I think the church has a lot of work to do to try to help people come back to a better sense of what it means to embrace human dignity, to embrace the fact that we belong to each other. That was something Mother Teresa said all the time: if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. And then to do the work of the messy work, the complex work of figuring out how we belong to each other. So that's my hope, that my work on moral injury and moral conscience will not only help us to better understand the moral harm that's been done, but also the work to bring about moral repair, and to try to do the work that's individual, interpersonal, and institutional, to repair the persistent psychological distress and spiritual anguish, the social distrust and the distrust for institutions, that will help us kind of recapture the right relationship that we receive in this biblical vision of shalom, right? The wholeness, the balance of life, in the conditions for everyone created to flourish personally and collectively.
Yeah, that's the vision that we have. The kingdom that God intends.
Right, exactly.
Well, are there any topics or issues that we haven't yet chatted about that we should let people know about, or they're on your mind?
I think you covered it all. Those were great questions, and I certainly spoke long enough. So I can't imagine anyone having the patience to endure much more of me.
No, it's been great. I've really appreciated your point of view on this. Great for the work that you're engaged in, and wish you the best as you continue. And I hope we'll get to talk to one another again soon.
Yeah, that would be great. I look forward to that. Thanks, James.
Great. Thank you.